It's happened at last. We've been speculating for the past 9 days. We've had 2 podcasts since then, wondering when Antonio Conte's post-match press conference at St Mary's was going to lead to his departure as Tottenham manager. It came on Sunday night. I think producer Charlie wanted to tear his hair out. He was ready for bed, as I'm sure many other news writers across the country were. But Tim, it's timely, as I said, having you in the studio. It was inevitable, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's been inevitable for a while, really. That he's going to leave Spurs. It was just a matter of when. I've sort of thought since Christmas, really, that
as long as that.
Well, the results really started to turn around then, and he was forever speaking of how Spurs is like a long-term project that needs young players to be given time to grow and develop. And yet there was never any suggestion that he was going to extend his contract beyond the end of the season. So, he cut a frustrated figure. It's been a very difficult few months for him as well. Although it didn't felt that the rant at Southampton was sort of a knock-on effect of that, because this is just what Conte does at every club he's at, basically. So yeah, it was always an imperfect fit in my mind. With the club looking to the long term. Average age of signings is 23 years old. They need time to nurture and grow. They don't need someone screaming and shouting at them and not putting their arm around their shoulder and not really telling them why they're not in the team and being quite aloof. And, that's just Conte's style, really. So it's a strange situation. I mean, I actually stopped covering Spurs last week. I had a nice, quite dull 6 months covering Charlie Eccleshare's paternity. And then he's come back last week to arrive to this. But I don't know, the post-Southampton sort of fallout, it's been interesting that everybody's been so focused on, well, he has to go now just because of what he said in the press conference. Because when you look at it, results have actually been pretty good. They've got like 16 points from 8 games and they're in 4th position. And I guess Levy's sort of conundrum has been, obviously Champions League football is so important to him and the club, less so to the fans, in my opinion. Can Conte guide them to 4th? And I think he's judged that Stellini did a pretty good job in his absence. And with sort of consistency in selection and certain players playing well, that they can reach 4th without Conte has obviously been his conclusion.
One thing I wanted to ask you, you've spent a lot of time around the club. How was he viewed by the players? Because when a manager leaves a club, you hear all of these rumours, don't you? Oh, he wasn't liked by the players anyway. The players are going to be happy he's gone. The players actually preferred Stellini. What was the feeling you got from the players' perspective?
I think some of them definitely liked him and loved playing for him. But in general, from things that I heard, training was definitely quite repetitive. I think particularly around the World Cup when there were quite a few players coming back, they were doing a lot of running, just running, and a lot of the players were like, "Why the hell are we doing this?" It was sort of like a pre-season, in December. And yeah, I think for certain players who know their games inside out and know themselves. They don't need the arm around the shoulder or the explanation as to why they're not in the team or whatever. Players like Harry Kane and maybe Son to an extent and Eric Dyer, they can look after themselves, Hugo Lloris. But I suppose I've got a lot of young players who need direction, and from what I'm told, that didn't really come from him. And he's quite a moody figure, and like I said, he's had a very few difficult few months personally, which we really shouldn't forget in all this. Lost 3 close friends and had gallbladder surgery as well, which is not an easy thing to recover from when you're as passionate and fiery and sort of 100% all in as him. So yeah, some of the results were desperately poor. You've got to say that, and even when they were winning games, it was not fun. It was not entertaining. It was unimaginative and sort of very predictable. When I started covering Spurs, I was really looking forward to seeing this. World-class manager at work. And after a few months, I was sort of like, there were so many problems with this team and he's just doing the same thing every single week. Particularly in terms of formation, I find it astounding that he would just play 3-4-3 every single week. And there were issues with certain players he just didn't play. Jed Spence and Arnaut Danjuma were both signed for Spurs this season, and he had no intention of playing either of those players because he didn't want them.
He made a comment, didn't he, about Danjuma where he said something like, the club signed him.
Yeah, and he did the same with Jed Spence last summer. And Jed Spence, as Daniel will know very well, had an incredible season for Nottingham Forest last season and has something to offer, albeit he's a young player. Danjuma scored a lot of important goals in the Champions League for Villarreal last season, and he's just had no intention of playing him, which is a crazy scenario. Then you've got the Sheffield United Cup defeat and the AC Milan Champions League tie. I mean, I went to both legs of that tie and I could not believe that I was watching a Champions League last 16 game. It was my first one. I was like, are they all like this? Because it was
underwhelming.
It was so underwhelming. There was no passion from Spurs. There was no desire to attack. It seemed like there was no desire to win the game. And in terms of how the players have been with Conte, the thing that was really stark for me was their best performance and result of the season came against Manchester City, when Conte was at home recovering from surgery, and he was very much not involved in that game. He was in bed, and he just had surgery, and he wasn't involved. And Spurs played brilliantly, and Christian Stellini and Ryan Mason introduced a really important tactical change during the game, where Eric Dyer went to man mark Bernardo Silva, who was just running the game in the first 20 minutes. They pushed Eric Dyer up, and that was a key reason why they won the game. Very impressive. A week later, Conte rushes back against all medical advice to go at Leicester City away. Daniel was there. And lo and behold, that Spurs produced their worst performance of the season a week after their best. And Conte was there. He could barely stand. He looked awful. And I don't know. At the time, you kind of say, is that coincidence? But looking back, you say no, really, I think, because the players clearly weren't playing for him, hadn't bought into his ideas. And ultimately, that was the most important factor in deciding to let him go now.
Christian Stellini, of course, was in the dugout that day and was there when Conte wasn't able to be with Spurs. He's going to stay until the end of the season. He's going to be assisted by Ryan Mason. Were you surprised to see that he was going to be the replacement? Because he was very much Conte's man previously.
It's very unusual for a coach to be sacked by a club and for his assistant to then be promoted in his stead, particularly as I suspect that Stellini's approach probably won't stray all that far from Conte's. I think it's probably an acknowledgement of the fact that given where we are in the season, with only a couple of months of the campaign remaining, the chances of getting in the next long-term coach and getting the appointment right in that very short time frame are probably quite slim. So you go for the continuity candidate, I suppose, with Ryan Mason, who of course has stepped into the breach when Spurs have sacked an unpopular manager in the not too distant past. So yeah, it's surprising to see an assistant promoted after his boss has been sacked. But as Tim was saying, the fact that he's already had appeared to have had a positive impact on Spurs' results and performances, that probably played that probably worked in his favour. But I think it's probably as much to do with the timing of things as anything else.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see, Daniel, won't it, if he has got managerial ambitions. Often when you see bosses given the opportunity for such a short spell, we say, this is their audition, isn't it, to get it on a permanent basis. Is that realistic at Spurs, or are they going to be looking to who's going to be available in the summer?
Yeah, I think they're going to be looking at who's available in the summer, either in terms of Nagelsmann or in terms of the much vaunted Pochettino return. I think, although this isn't a clean break from Conte and his people, it sounds like there's an understanding whereby Conte's outburst against Southampton made that position untenable. I thought Daniel Levy's statement, in which he barely mentions Conte by name, he just sort of says, we've got 10 games left, we've got to get in the Champions League, that's what we're going to try and do. We need everyone, I think he used the phrase like everyone needs to pull together, which felt like a pretty obvious dig at Conte's kind of self-implosion of the club. So yeah, I think it's a kind of business as usual, but without the guy that's slagging everyone off. I think it probably is almost as simple as that. And then, I think in the summer, Spurs are going to go for a manager who I hope this time that, Tim mentioned earlier, but like fits that ideal of long-termism. I don't know if that's Pochettino because there are inevitable reflections of the past in that, but then maybe that feels like an itch they need to scratch. I don't know.
It depends which Spurs fans you speak to, I think, because there's a lot of them that are crying out for Pochettino, but as Daniel said then, it is looking backwards rather than forwards. So you can't deny the impact he had. Pochettino's the only Spurs manager with a better points per game ratio than Conte in the Premier League.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think they'll go back. I think.
Would he go back as well? That's the other question. Do you think he would?
I think he seems to be angling for a Premier League job, and there won't be many Big Six jobs that come up in the near future. And he's not going to stay out of work for too long. the Stellini thing is interesting because one thing he said which really resonated with me was before the Chelsea game, he was asked about Graham Potter, and he spoke about how much he admired Graham Potter and had studied him last season. And in particular, he liked how he would change tactics during games and before games and change formation all the time. And I was like, right, you clearly didn't have that chat with Conte, or Conte clearly doesn't agree with you on that front. So yeah, I'm sure he will introduce some different ideas, but ultimately it's not about him. I'm sure he won't get the job in the summer. And yeah, it's a massive appointment. I mean, Spurs' last 3 appointments have all failed. I think it was James Horncastle who said last week, they haven't really moved on from Pochettino or got over him yet. And yeah, they've, for a club whose fans sort of pride themselves on having a stylish attacking team, he's hired 3, I would say, back foot managers, pragmatic managers.
Is that you upsetting Nuno there?
Yeah, in Nuno, Mourinho, and Conte, I think that you could label them all as sort of pragmatic and back foot. It doesn't mean they can't be attacking, but certainly it's that approach first and foremost. I think Spurs fans want front foot football, and the age of the next manager doesn't necessarily matter, but it's got to be someone fresh with an exciting attack-minded philosophy. I think that's what the club's fans want. And yeah, they're such a confusing club, off the field, they do everything brilliantly. The stadium's astonishing, as we all know. The training ground, the NFL, the Beyonce, Lady Gaga, the F1 now as well. But ultimately, if I was a fan paying £1,000 for a season ticket, which most of them are, I wouldn't care about any of that, to be honest. One other thing to mention is that there are 2 other important people at play here. Fabio Paratici, the director of football, who ultimately will play a key part in this decision, today starts a court case in Italy, with several other former colleagues from Juventus into alleged financial irregularities. That's got to play, have a massive bearing on what happens to him and Spurs in the next few months. If he's the man ultimately making that decision, that seems absurd to me. And there were suggestions recently that he's banned from Italian football for 2 years, but he could potentially be banned from European football, depending on what UEFA and FIFA do at the end of all this, which is a mess. And then the other one is Harry Kane, who is out of contract in the summer, and having watched Spurs for 6 months, I can say, and it's backed up by statistics, that without him they would probably be in mid-table this season. He creates and he scores, and he is their talisman and captain at the moment, and he's everything to them, and he I'm sure him and Levy have a functional working relationship, and you'd imagine that his opinion may have something to do, may have some sway in the summer. So
I was listening to a podcast that was recorded post-match last night on the way in here, and I really felt for Harry Kane, because at the end the reporter said to him, and now of course back to Spurs, and he said, yeah, it's been quite eventful. And I thought, obviously that was way before Conte was sacked. And I was like, oh, Harry, it's about to get more eventful. You don't quite know what's coming next.
But I think the important thing for Spurs is appointing a coach who puts smiles on people's faces, which is something you hear about a lot in sport, and it's often a cliche. But, you look at the 3 managerial appointments that they've made. Conte and Mourinho were supposed to be, they're going to ruffle feathers and people won't like what they have to say, but they'll bring success. And they ruffled feathers and people didn't like what they had to say.
And they
brought
success.
No success. And Nuno kind of did a bit of Nunoing in the middle, and we all forgot that he was even there. I think for all, with apologies.
Can't say that in
with apologies. But I think with all those factors, particularly the Harry Kane factor, if Spurs fans can find themselves in a position next season of going to the stadium and looking forward to what they're going to see, that will feel like a real step change.
It's been awful. Even the journalists. Think of the journalists. Someone,
that's exactly what I was thinking.
I've left part of my soul.
Someone think of the poor journalists.
I've left part of my soul in that job. It was awful. If they weren't even bothered about the AC Milan game. That's how much they've been ground down by not just the last 6 months, but the last few years. Like, yeah, they want and deserve more.
I do think it's a really bad job to take in the summer, I have to say. Like, you've got Harry Kane, who we don't know what his future is, but whatever happens, it's going to be a story all summer. You've got Heung-min Son, who seems to have either tailed off or just isn't feeling it, but he turns 31 in the summer. You need probably 2 new goalkeepers, because Lloris is 36 and Fraser Forster's 35. Like, the big signings are Tanguy and Ndombele, Davies and Sanchez, these £40 million signings that just haven't worked. They've got 9 players out on loan, including some of those expensive signings. It's not a squad in which there's very obvious fits quickly for this to get better, and it's had £250 million spent on it by Conte or under Conte's reign, and I don't think that's sustainable either in terms of the finances. So like, it's not a great job to take, I don't think. And so in that case, it kind of needs to be an up and coming manager who'll kind of grow with it, I think. And yet that in itself is a risk, because if it doesn't work, then you quickly slump down to 6th, 7th position in the league.
But it'll be fun to watch.
And the stadium's really nice as well.
That's what Spurs
And I'm
are
going
for.
to see Beyonce there in the summer.
Oh, there you go. There'll be smiles on faces at least once at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium this year.
The Totally Football Show podcast is available 3 times a week, bringing you all the football news you could reasonably be expected to care about. We've got views, we've got stats, we've got analysis, we've got some of the best football writers around, and the whole thing is absolutely free. So have a listen on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or all the usual places by clicking on the link below.